Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Hub Bites. I'm Sanil Rege, consultant psychiatrist. Today I'll be taking you through the fascinating world of the gut-brain axis. I think all of you would have heard this explosion of terms such as the microbiome, gut health, the gut-brain axis, fecal transplantation, all of those things. So I'll be covering some of the neurobiology behind that and check out the evidence for fecal microbiota transplantation, probiotics, etc. So let's jump into it. Firstly, the big question: can poo treat psychiatric disorders? And we have this whole field of fecal FMT, it's called fecal microbiota transplant. It's a systematic review that's been done recently on the symptoms of psychiatric disorders. Can poo help psychiatric disorders? And just recently published. So let's look at what it says. There appears to be strong evidence for the treatment and transmission of psychiatric illnesses through fecal microbiota transplantation. So interestingly, and transmission, why? Because we will see that the microbiome consists of what we can divide into good bacteria, bad bacteria, etc. So one can not only induce psychiatric symptoms, and one can treat it as well with the appropriate balance of the microbiome. And it says further research with larger sample sizes and stronger scientific design is warranted in order to fully determine the efficacy and safety of this potential treatment. So obviously in the early stages, but case reports are present. We know that fecal microbiota transplantation is being used in ulcerative colitis and other inflammatory intestinal disorders. The other thing that we can see here is, let's just go back, and I've added this sort of stuff, but this is progress in neuropsychopharmacology and biological psychiatry, the journal. And again, gut microbiota alteration and modulation in psychiatric disorders. And what's the current evidence? This is 2021 July. So again, very, very recent. And what we can see here is imbalances of the gut microbiota related to psychiatric disorders. Fecal microbiota transplantation can impair mental health in recipient animals, and fecal microbiota transplantation is promising in relieving psychiatric symptoms. So again, a really, really promising, I guess, field that we might see more of in the future. So let's go into a bit more detail about what this gut microbiome is all about. Now, there are 12 different phyla. Well, and these are, in a way, think about it as species, in a simple way of putting it. 90% consist of the following, which are proteobacteria, firmicutes, actinobacteria, and bacteroidetes, right? So these are the four key phyla. And they've done sort of experiments looking at quality of life, depression associated with certain bacteria. And what they found was Faecalibacterium and Coprococcus are associated with higher levels of quality of life, whilst Dialista and Coprococcus are depleted in depression. So obviously this particular one seems to be associated with with mental health disorders and improving it in a way. Now, what does a microbiome actually refer to? It refers to all microorganisms in or on their host, as well as their genetic material. So this is a microbiome. It's sort of an ecosystem in a way. On the other hand, the microbiota defines the micropopulation in a specific ecosystem, such as those populations found in the gut microbiota, skin microbiota. So microbiome is all the microorganisms. Microbiota refers to, say, for example, that specific ecosystem on the skin microbiota, gut microbiota. Collectively, the genetic material of the microbiome is approximately 150 times greater than the human genome, which has led some scientists to label this microbiome as a superorganism. So we've got a separate superorganism within our human body, which is just absolutely fascinating. Now, what is the gut-brain axis? Essentially, it's the connection between the gut and the brain. So it's a bidirectional communication, though. So the gut talks to the brain, and the brain talks to the gut. it's a connection between the central, as I said, and the enteric nervous system. So not only we know the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, but there is the nervous system of the gut as well. It links the emotional and the cognitive centers of the brain with peripheral intestinal functions. Now, much of the research that's happened into the brain-gut axis has involved germ-free animals and studying the effects of antibiotics, probiotics, and fecal transplants to determine their effects on gut microbiota on brain activity, right? So you want germ-free, so you don't want that contamination. Now, many of these studies suggest that gut microbiota produces relevant levels of neurotransmitters, and we'll look at some of these later on. And they're responsible, and we know that serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine are important aspects when it comes to psychiatric disorders. So let's look at the HP axis firstly. We know that stress, trauma impacts this hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, and cortisol plays an important role here. And what's shown is that stress-induced changes can actually collectively alter the composition, function, and metabolic activity of the gut microbiota, right? And let's see how it does it. So firstly, let me orient you, all of you to this. Now, you can have a listen to the video that we've done on this channel on how stress and trauma affect the brain, where I've gone into a little bit more detail, not necessarily linked to the gut microbiota, but more about the other aspects. Now, here we know that stress really can affect the limbic system. And when stress occurs, we have certain parts of the brain that triggered. So we know that the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing factor, which then goes to the pituitary. And from the pituitary, we have ACTH that will stimulate the adrenals to release cortisol, right? And we know cortisol is the anti-inflammatory hormone, so reduces inflammation, all of those things that are necessary. And we'll talk about this IL-6 because this is a particular cytokine that has the connection backwards. So what it'll do is it activates the HP axis. So it'll set up this feedback loop of just constant activation. Now, with cortisol, what happens is cortisol will act on the enteric muscles, it will act on the immune cells, and it will also act on the microbiota, right? And what we see here is, so you can see we have the immune cells, we have the B cells, we have the T cells as well, and increased cortisol. So a certain amount of cortisol is helpful, but increased cortisol leads to what's called a leaky gut. So this gap means that cytokines can be released. There's that leaky gut and lots of further cytokines are released. Then once IL-6, it'll continually activate it. So you get this continuous feedback loop of cortisol being secreted. And then IL-6 will also downregulate the glucocorticoid receptors. So what we've got here is a leaky gut drives a pro-inflammatory state, as evidenced by increased levels of TNF-alpha, interferon alpha, IL-6. IL-6 activates HPA axis, downregulates glucocorticoid receptors, removing the feedback loop, resulting in a hypersensitive HP axis. So you get this feedback loop that's not helpful and it's pro-inflammatory. We talked about neurotransmitters. Now we know there's accumulating evidence that bacteria secrete neuroactive compounds that affect sleep, appetite, mood, cognition. And these neuroactive compounds can act locally on the enteric nervous system, but also can act on the brain by crossing the blood-brain barrier or by communicating through vagal chemoreceptors. So if we go back, we can see this connection to the vagus nerve. So from the intestine, you can have this connection to the nerve through the vagal system. Then we have something known as short-chain fatty acids. Now, short-chain fatty acids are the main metabolites produced by the microbiota in the large intestine through the anaerobic fermentation of indigestible polysaccharides such as dietary fiber and resistant starch. So this is where diet and microbiome also becomes important. So I've written an article on Psychiatric Hub on diet and depression where I talk about the impacts of diet on the microbiome as well. Then we have BDNF. Now, brain-derived neurotrophic factor is really a fertilizer for the brain, helping in neurogenesis, neuroprotection, etc. Now, what happens is because of this gut-brain link, if we have too much inflammation, then it actually reduces the levels of brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is not a good thing. And I've covered this more in the talk that I did on neuroinflammation. So do have a listen to that on this channel as well. Then we have the vagus nerve, which I've just showed you. Now, this is really interesting because the intestinal nervous system consists of 200 to 600 million neurons. And therefore, it's given the term superbrain. So what we've got is we've got a superorganism, we've got a superbrain, and all that's in the gut. Then, these neurons are controlled predominantly by the vagus nerve, and thus the vagus nerve acts as a primary connection between the brain and the proximal intestinal tract. Now, it's interesting when we think about vagal nerve because you might have heard vagal nerve stimulation is a treatment for depression. In fact, there is a hypothesis that when transcranial magnetic stimulation is carried out for treating depression, the downstream effect may occur partly through the vagus nerve. So you have this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex stimulation, but the connections from there towards the anterior cingulate and then from the anterior cingulate to the vagus system is probably one of the hypotheses. So again, you can have a listen to that to the interview that I've done on TMS as well. We have got a playlist on TMS on this channel. Then we have lipopolysaccharides, LPS. Now this is a pro-inflammatory endotoxin that's produced. It's a component of the outer membrane of the gram-negative bacteria, and this can trigger its self-inflammatory responses that's been associated with a range of psychiatric disorders, including pain. Now, micronutrients. We have gut microbiomes produces water-soluble vitamins and affects the intestinal absorption of micronutrients. So dysbiosis, which is really a dysfunction of the gut microbiome, can result in a deficiency of micronutrients, contributing to depression. Role of antibiotics. Now, there's a study that has been carried out in a large population study. They found that they looked at the risk of depression, anxiety, psychosis after a single antibiotic course. And what they observed was that microbiota dysbiosis caused by recurrent antibiotic exposure increased the risk of depression, anxiety, but not psychosis. Now, of course, all of these things need to be taken into context. We need to know whether this is truly causal. Antibiotics are necessary to treat infections. So this is not to say that they shouldn't be used. But in general, the authors suggest that antibiotic usage reduces gut microbiota diversity and increases susceptibility to pathogen colonization. And we know that excessive use of antibiotics can result in, say, thrush in certain parts. We know that excessive penicillin use can lead to that black hairy tongue, which is the growth of fungus, etc. So we know that it can affect, the colonization of bad bacteria, etc., by killing good bacteria in a way. Different antibiotics differentially affect the gut microbiota, although most antibiotics will induce a stress response in commensal bacteria. So to sort of summarize it in a diagram, what we can see here is, as I mentioned, we've got the enteric nervous system connection to the brain, and I'll show you that a lot of it happens through the vagus nerve here, the extrinsic nervous system, the vagus nerve. Then we've got, you can think about it as a neuroepithelial unit, so the nerve and then the epithelium, the gut epithelium. Then we've got what's known as the GALT, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, and this is where a lot of the T cells and B cells and all that lymphoid tissue that's necessary to fight infections becomes important. These are the enterocytes, B cells, T cells, right? So that's all parts of the gut immune system. And then we've got the intestinal nervous system, which we call the second brain, 200 to 600 million neurons. So let's look at some of the things. We've got the bacteria here, and we know that when it comes to neurotransmitters, lactobacillus can secrete acetylcholine. Candida, Streptococcus, E. coli, and Enterococcus can secrete serotonin. Bacilli and Serratia can secrete dopamine, right? So all of this can pass through this, can connect and affect the brain. Then we have the LPS, as I mentioned, the lipopolysaccharide. So this is the gram-negative endotoxin from the surface. And then we also have short-chain fatty acids, as I talked about. which is produced the metabolites through the anaerobic fermentation. And the short-chain fatty acids can cross the blood-brain barrier and can influence neuroinflammation, neurogenesis. Then, the nerve cell of the vagus nerve or the spinal cord, and that can influence the brain as well through its connection, as I've shown here. And increased vagal nerve activity can lead to enteric neuroinflammation, which can lead to anxiety. And there is some evidence that probiotics administration in animal studies showed anti-anxiety effects mediated by the vagal nerve. So there's some evidence there. So the big question is, can probiotics help, right? We know that over-the-counter probiotics are available. There's a lot of talk about probiotics, prebiotics helping the gut health, etc., etc. But this is the evidence. Firstly, what are the criteria for classification? What is a probiotic? Firstly, that microbes must be alive in an adequate number when administered. We know it comes in yogurt as well nowadays. Strains must be identified genetically, classified using the latest terminology, and designated by numbers, letters, or names. So you'll see that if you ever take a yogurt sort of box, Yakult or so many different ones, I think Benecol as well has it probably, and look in the back and you'll see these numbers and names mentioned. Appropriately sized, and they'll say, billion, a good bacteria present, etc. Appropriately sized and designed studies must be performed to designate a strain as a probiotic, and using the strains on the host to which the probiotics are intended, human, livestock, companion animal, etc. Strains shown to confer a benefit for one condition may not be a probiotic for another condition. Strains that are probiotic for humans but are being used in animal studies should be clearly designated as human probiotics under experimental testing. So potential mechanisms for action for pro and prebiotics are regulating the capacity of the intestinal microbiota, preserving the integrity of the intestinal barrier, so that's the leaky gut, preventing that, and preventing bacteria translocation. So remember I talked about the outer surface of the LPS, the lipopolysaccharide of the gram-negative bacteria, which can act as an endotoxin. That's the other thing. It prevents bacterial translocation and regulating local inflammatory reaction through the intestinal immune system. So evidence suggests that daily consumption of probiotic supplement could have a positive effect in improving mood, anxiety, and cognitive symptoms present in MDD. Probiotics may have the most significant effect on symptoms of anxiety, which is often comorbid with MDD. And according to the systematic review by Wallace and Milev, 2017, now, of course, I've written in much more detail on diet, depression. I've also talked about prebiotics, probiotics there. The robust evidence compiled and presented in this review, so I've talked about a gut microbiome depression, that's where I've covered all of this, indicates that treatments with probiotics may improve symptoms associated with MDD by increasing serotonin availability and or decreasing levels of inflammatory markers. We know that inflammatory depression is a subset. The potential of probiotics to be used as novel treatment could have a major impact on those seeking antidepressant treatment by reducing stigma, latency, and side effects associated with typical antidepressants. Despite extensive preclinical data and clinical effects of probiotics in mental health have yet to be studied comprehensively in a sample of depressed patients. So more research is required, as it says, to warrant, to determine rather the probiotics efficacy. Very similar aspect with fecal microbiota transplantation. There are good case studies in the treatment of mood disorders, bipolarity, depression, etc. So case studies are present, but we need to know whether this can be applied as a whole to the population. It remains to be seen whether that's something that will show promise in psychiatric disorders, but a fascinating idea nonetheless, showing a lot of promise. So I hope that this has given you sort of an overview of this fascinating the microbiome in a way, the gut microbiota, the links between the gut and the brain. And many of you might know that, an interesting fact that 80% of serotonin in the body is actually produced in the gut, in the enterochromaffin cells, and only 20% in the dorsal raphe nucleus in the brain. So, we've always known that there is that link. Maybe words such as gut feeling linked to emotions come from that wisdom from the past, potentially. So, or the knowledge from the past. So nonetheless, I hope that you found this video useful. And of course, if you liked it, give us a like, subscribe, so that you are notified of sort of further videos. And of course, always let me know what else you'd like me to cover. And finally, a big thank you to all of you for watching, giving up your time. I really, really appreciate it. Take care, and I'll see you in another video soon. Bye-bye.